He didn't growl, didn't whine, didn't beg for food or look back once at the place he left behind. The dog just walked, slow, steady, like he had somewhere to be before his bones gave out. Each morning he appeared in a new town, and by nightfall, someone's life had quietly shifted. No one called him. No one claimed him. But when he laid down by your door, the past you tried to bury started breathing again. Elen, a 79-year-old widow who hid her loneliness behind fence paint, couldn't yet know the old shepherd came to unearth what silence had buried. Jim, a grizzled war veteran with more scars than friends, had no idea the mud on his porch was waiting for him to start over. Bernice, a motel-dwelling mother clinging to memory, certainly couldn't realize that a four-legged drifter would return her granddaughter by carrying a dress from the past. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Now, let's begin. It all started with the kind of quiet that presses against your chest, not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows after something old and cherished has left the room forever. The sky that day didn't cry, didn't roar, didn't even whisper. It just sat above the old farmhouse like it had already moved on, same as everyone else. The funeral was small, as these things often are when a man outlives most of the folks he ever called friends or family, and the dirt that covered his pine box fell with a thud that felt far too final for the life he had lived. No one said much at the gravesite, but plenty was spoken later, over sandwiches and coffee that had gone cold before anyone thought to drink it, in a house that no longer smelled like pipe tobacco and old wood polish. His niece, sharp-jawed, tight-lipped, with a Bluetooth in her ear and a schedule in her hand, took control like someone who had waited for this moment a little too eagerly. She walked through the house with the efficiency of a banker evaluating a loan, deciding what would be sold, what could be tossed, and what might fetch a few bucks online if listed just right. No one noticed the dog sitting by the screen door, his ears twitching, eyes unmoving, body still as stone, as though waiting for his old man to come back from the barn with a pocket full of jerky. His name was Miles, though nobody called him that anymore, and by nightfall, no one seemed to remember he existed at all. You see, Miles wasn't just a dog. He was what you might call a witness, one of those quiet souls that watched life happen with the patience of years and the wisdom of someone who had nothing left to prove. That night, the niece made a phone call from the front porch, her voice low and dismissive, saying something about the dog and a shelter and we don't have time for this. An hour later, a car pulled up, low to the ground, engine knocking with age, driver silent, and the back door open like it was doing Miles a favor. They didn't look at him when they shoved him in, didn't speak to him when they dropped him off at the edge of a gravel road that stretched out like a scar across the countryside. The car drove off without slowing, and Miles sat there a long while, ears high, nose tilted to the wind, waiting for something in the air to tell him what to do. And then, without ceremony or hesitation, he stood and began to walk, not with panic, not with aimlessness, but with the kind of quiet determination you only see in someone who remembers the road home without needing to explain why. The shelter they intended for him never saw him. The volunteers who might have bathed him, clipped his nails, and wondered about his cloudy eyes would never know he'd been there at all. Because something inside Miles, something older than obedience, deeper than grief, was pulling him forward, away from the past and into a road that didn't promise anything but a direction. Each step stirred up dust like echoes from an old song, and his paws pressed into the dirt with the certainty of someone following a path he had walked once in another lifetime. It's a strange thing, the way animals hold onto places, how their bodies remember the feel of earth beneath them, the smell of oak trees in spring, the ghost of someone's voice calling them home at dusk. Miles didn't need a leash, didn't need a plan, didn't even need hope. What he needed was the road, and by God, the road was there, waiting like it knew he was coming. The first night, he slept beneath a billboard advertising retirement plans he would never need. The second, under a broken windmill that creaked with the weight of its own memories. By the third, he had made it to the edge of a town whose name had faded on the welcome sign, the letters peeled and forgotten like a postcard from a friend who never wrote back. And it was there, under the blue haze of early morning, that he saw her, an old woman with silver hair and a paintbrush, slowly covering the same slat of fence she had painted yesterday, and the day before that, and probably the day before that, too. Her hand shook as she dipped the brush, not with age, but with something else, something deeper, like a mind unraveling itself stitch by stitch. She didn't see him at first, not really, just muttered to herself and pressed the brush against the wood with a sigh that sounded like it had been living in her lungs for 20 years. Miles didn't bark. He didn't whine or wag. He simply laid down by the gate and waited. When she finally noticed him, really noticed him, she said, "Well, you've got the wrong place, mister. No one's home here but ghosts." But Miles didn't move. And something in her voice cracked, just a little, just enough to let out a name she hadn't spoken aloud in over a decade, Eliza. She dropped the brush without realizing it. Her eyes filled with something that wasn't quite recognition but wasn't confusion either, like she saw in Miles the outline of something she had almost remembered, but not quite. Her hand hovered near the gate, but she didn't open it. Not yet. "Why are you just lying there like you know me?" she asked, voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Did somebody send you?" "Yes," said Elen's own voice, though it didn't feel like it came from her mouth, not at first, more like it rose up from her memory, from someplace tender and unfinished inside her chest. A place she hadn't dared visit since the day she watched that old Buick disappear down the hill. "Yes, somebody did send him," she said again, slower this time, as if the truth was finally stretching its legs after sleeping far too long. She didn't mean it like a fact to be debated. No, sir. Not the way you mean it when you've got proof in paper. She meant it the way an old song reminds you of someone you haven't thought about in years, but when it hits your ear just right, you know down to your bones that it's them. That dog had come looking for something, sure as daylight, and it wasn't food or shelter. There was intention in those eyes, like he'd been watching for her, waiting for her, maybe even walking for her. Elen hadn't had company in weeks, maybe months if she was honest, and the kind she used to have had mostly stopped coming after the second year she turned folks away at Christmas. When Henry passed, people brought pies. When Eliza left, they brought casseroles. But after a while, they stopped bringing anything at all. Grief, she'd learned, was heavy, and folks didn't like standing too close to someone still carrying it like a suitcase with no handle. But Miles, he didn't flinch from it. He didn't circle her like she might break or make him feel guilty for not knowing what to say. He just laid there, patient as a tombstone, and blinked every now and then like he had all the time in the world and didn't mind using it on her. On the third morning, Elen opened the gate. Not because she trusted him, and not because she was ready to talk, but because she had this strange ache in her chest that felt an awful lot like hope trying to be born again. Miles walked through that gate like he belonged there, and when he reached the porch, he sat, didn't beg, didn't bark, just sat there like he'd been sitting there every morning of her life. Elen brought out a bowl of water, poured it slow like a ritual, and placed it near the edge of the steps. "That's all I got for you," she said, though even she could hear the lie in her voice, because the truth was, she had a little more. A little tea. A little time. A little story she'd never told anyone in full, not even Henry. God rest his practical soul. That afternoon, she watched Miles wander toward the old shed out back, the one Henry used to keep his tools in, the one she hadn't opened since Eliza left. She followed him at a distance, arms folded against the breeze, and saw him nudge his nose against the bottom slats of the wooden frame, like something inside had caught his attention. The wood groaned when she pulled it open, revealing that cracked, sun-faded box she thought she'd hidden better, letters she wrote over a dozen years ago, each one sealed and unsent, a whole world of could-have-beens locked away in ink and stubbornness. She sat with the box in her lap under the pecan tree, and for the first time in a long while, she let her hands shake. Inside those letters were pages of love that got lost behind pride, and pages of hurt that had hardened into silence. Elen read the first one aloud, not for the dog's sake, but for her own, because speaking those words aloud made them real, and real things have a way of needing to be reckoned with. By sundown, she had read 6 of them. By moonrise, she had chosen one to rewrite. She didn't rewrite it better. She rewrote it honest, not with fancy words or long apologies, but with the truth plain and soft as a blanket folded at the foot of a guest bed, just waiting for someone to come home. The next morning, she mailed it. She stood at the postbox with her hand on the metal edge, her heart thudding like it hadn't in years, and whispered, "If you're still out there, baby, if you're still angry, I'm sorry I waited so long to come find you." Miles didn't follow her to the mailbox. He was already gone. No sound, no goodbye, just the smell of dust and dog and something else, something clean, like a page turning. Elen walked back toward her porch, slower than usual, but taller somehow, and when she sat down, she stared out at the long road winding past the edge of her property. She didn't cry, not yet, but there was a soft shine in her eyes that hadn't been there in many seasons. And then, From across the street, a man pushing a rusted lawnmower paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. He looked over, saw the empty spot beside her porch swing, and called out with a half-smile and a curious squint, "Hey, Miss Elen, where'd that dog of yours wander off to?" "I reckon he came looking for me," said the man on the edge of town, his voice like gravel under boots, slow and deliberate, the way a man talks when he hasn't spoken to anyone in weeks and isn't in a hurry to be heard. He didn't say it loud, didn't shout across fences or call it down from a front step, just murmured it to the wind as he looked out from the crooked frame of his trailer's busted porch. The boards had been rotting for years, sagging with the weight of storms and time, but nobody much came by anymore to notice, and Jim hadn't seen the point in fixing it for just himself. His left leg, stiff and metal from the knee down, made climbing those creaky steps a slow kind of war every morning, and after enough battles lost to gravity, he'd given up trying altogether. Most days, he just sat on the top step with a thermos of black coffee and a cigarette he didn't light, watching dust gather on the engine blocks out front and wondering how long it'd take the weeds to bury them completely. He'd fought in a war once, back when his eyes were sharp and his hands didn't tremble when he buttoned a shirt. Vietnam had left more than shrapnel in his thigh. It had carved out pieces of him that never quite healed right, and the doctors back home were better at fixing bones than they were at patching up the soul. When he came back, the world had changed, and so had he, but not in ways that made sense to people who hadn't been there. So he drank, mostly, and tinkered with broken things, and told himself the silence was a kind of peace. But that peace cracked wide open the day he looked up from his chair and saw the old dog standing at the edge of the gravel, head tilted just enough to say, "You still in there, fella?" There was nothing urgent about the dog's arrival. No bark, no jump, no tail beating like a drum. Just presence. Just patience. Miles didn't ask for permission. He simply stepped onto the porch and lay down next to the rotting rail with a groan that echoed somewhere deep inside Jim's chest. For a long moment, they didn't look at each other, didn't need to. Some silences, after all, carry more understanding than 1,000 words ever could. The next morning, Jim sat down with his coffee and looked at the dog, who was still there, breathing slow, eyes open, like he'd been waiting all night just to make sure Jim hadn't disappeared in the dark. Without quite knowing why, Jim said, "You're wasting your time, old boy. There's nothing left worth guarding here." Miles didn't move. That afternoon, Jim reached for a hammer. He hadn't built anything in years, hadn't even opened his toolbox since his neighbor passed, and the Little League stopped bringing their bikes over to be fixed. But there was something about the way that dog lay so still, not watching him exactly, but witnessing him, that made it impossible to keep pretending he was invisible. So he started with the porch rail, just the one piece, just to get it out of the way, and before he knew it, he was muttering under his breath about warped wood and rusted nails like he used to, back when things were simple and Sunday mornings still meant something. By the third day, the porch was halfway rebuilt, and Jim's hands were sore in that good, honest way that comes from doing something real with them. He hadn't realized how much he missed the sound of nails sinking deep into solid wood, how it quieted the noise in his head that never seemed to stop when he sat still too long. Miles stayed close, sometimes watching, sometimes dozing, always quiet. And then came the boy. He couldn't have been more than 10, maybe 11 at the most, riding a hand-me-down bike with one handlebar wrapped in duct tape and the other bent like it had been through a storm. Jim heard the chain rattle before he saw him, and when the kid stopped at the end of the drive, staring wide-eyed at the porch under construction, Jim muttered, "Lord, I ain't ready for this." The boy didn't say anything, just looked. And then he pointed at the dog. "Is he yours?" Jim thought about it for a moment, then said, "I think he's everybody's. Or nobody's. Depends on how you look at it." The boy didn't smile. He just nodded like that made sense somehow, then asked, "Can I help with the porch?" Jim started to shake his head, instinct pulling him back to the comfort of solitude, but then he looked at the kid's bike, at the torn sleeve of his shirt, at the silence in his eyes, and something in him cracked a little. Not in a painful way. More like ice thawing after a long winter. "Only if you know the difference between a flathead and a Phillips," Jim said. The boy grinned. "My grandpa taught me." Jim handed him a screwdriver. They worked in silence for a while, the kind that builds something more than wood and nails. By the end of the week, the porch was solid, the boy's bike had new pedals, and Jim had found a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Miles, as always, remained close but quiet, like a guardian who knew when to step in and when to simply let healing happen. One evening, as the sun poured gold across the porch and the boys sat cross-legged on the steps eating a peanut butter sandwich, Jim lit a cigarette he didn't need and said, "I ever tell you I used to fix whole engines with just a wrench and a prayer?" The boy shook his head. "You gonna teach me?" Jim looked down at his hands, stained with grease and memory, and said, "Yeah, kid. I think I will." The next morning, Miles was gone. No sound, no fuss. Just the creak of the porch swing and the scent of sawdust still lingering in the air. Jim stood at the top step, watching the road beyond the weeds, and whispered, "Guess your work here's done, huh?" The boy, wiping sweat from his brow, looked up at him and asked, "Where do you think he goes next?" "Well," said Bernice quietly, her fingers resting on the edge of the faded dress that lay like a folded secret across her lap, "I think he comes to the ones who are ready to remember, even if they don't know it yet." She hadn't spoken much that morning, hadn't spoken much in general since the day the hospital called and the world went quiet all at once. Folks had tried, of course, they always did, with their casseroles and polite half-hugs and awkward silences, but most of them left within 10 minutes, glancing at their watches and saying things like, "You're strong," which never helped and never would. It had been 20 years since her daughter, Mary Ellen, passed on a Sunday afternoon that should have ended with pot roast and hymns, not funeral plans and a preacher talking about God's timing. In the time since, Bernice had moved out of the big house, sold off the garden furniture, and taken a room at a roadside motel near the edge of a town that didn't ask too many questions and didn't give too many answers. Room 6 was small, but it had just enough space for the things she still believed mattered. A coffee pot that worked most days, a rocking chair someone had left by the dumpster, and the blue dress. It had belonged to Mary Ellen, worn once on her 23rd birthday, the one where she danced barefoot under the porch light and sang along to a Patsy Cline record like her heart had never been broken. Bernice kept the dress sealed in a dry cleaner's bag, hanging from a nail beside the window, and once a week, always on Sundays, she took it down, laid it across her lap, and just sat there, breathing in the years. She didn't cry anymore, not really. Her grief had aged like an old dog, still there, still loyal, but no longer barking. She had almost missed the dog's arrival. Miles didn't knock, didn't bark, didn't even scratch at the door. He just sat outside the motel room, quiet and still, staring at her through the small window, his eyes steady, his body unmoving like a statue carved from memory itself. It was the manager who noticed him first. "That your dog?" he asked, knocking on her door with that same nervousness folks had when asking about anything personal. Bernice walked out in her slippers, pulled tight the cardigan she hadn't buttoned properly, and saw him there, dusty, tired, silent, just watching her with the kind of eyes that don't look at you, but into you. "No," she said slowly. "But he looks like he's got something to tell me." That night, for the first time in years, she left the dress out on the bed instead of putting it away. She made 2 cups of tea, though one went cold. She played the Patsy Cline record again, the same one Mary Ellen used to love, and found herself humming along quiet at first, then louder, until the walls seemed to hold the notes in place like they'd been waiting all this time. The next morning, the dress was gone. Not stolen, not misplaced. Just gone. The hanger still hung where it always had. But the fabric, the buttons, the soft blue ribbon, all of it had vanished like a ghost that finally got permission to leave. Panic rose in her chest like a wave, but before she could speak, before she could even step outside, there was a soft knock at the door. Not from a hand, not from a person. It was the sound of fabric brushing wood, the kind of sound you only recognize if you've spent 20 years memorizing the weight of it. She opened the door, and there it was, the dress, folded neatly at her doorstep, clean as the day it was bought, smelling faintly of lilacs and warm wind. And beside it, Miles. He looked up at her once, then nudged the dress gently with his nose, as if to say, "It's time now." Bernice stepped outside and picked it up with hands that shook for the first time in years, not from fear or age, but from the feeling of being remembered. She clutched the dress to her chest and closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she saw a small figure walking down the motel sidewalk toward her. A girl, maybe 13, uncertain steps, quiet face, brown hair, soft eyes. Bernice blinked once, twice, 3 times, and in that child's walk, there was something familiar, something achingly familiar. The girl stopped 5 feet away and looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "I think you might be my grandmother." Bernice didn't speak right away. Instead, she held up the dress. "Do you know what this is?" The girl nodded. My mom had one just like it. She told me before she died. And just like that, the years fell away, and Bernice took a step forward, not a big one, just enough to let the girl know it was okay. She placed the dress in her hands, and for the first time in decades, Bernice felt something shift deep inside her ribs, a place that had been locked up tight, now breathing again. They didn't hug. Not yet. But they stood close enough for healing to begin. That night, Bernice looked out the motel window and saw only darkness. Miles was gone. But his absence didn't feel like a hole this time. It felt like something had been sewn shut again, stitched by memory, forgiveness, and the quiet work of a dog who never asked for thanks. In the morning, the motel manager brought her a cup of coffee and, scratching his head, asked, "So where'd he go?" "That dog of yours." "Well," said Clarence Harper, his voice low and thick with gravel, the kind that builds up after 79 years of bourbon, with smoke, and too many things left unsaid. "I'd be a dead man right now if that dog hadn't shown up when he did." Clarence wasn't the type to exaggerate. Never had been. The folks who remembered him from before his wife passed, before the town shrank, before the trailer started leaning like a tired man against the hillside, knew him as a man who kept to himself, kept his tools sharp, and didn't complain even when he had every right to. He had been an ironworker once, a union man who poured his bones into steel bridges and radio towers that still cut the sky. But steel don't make for warm company, and when Madeline died, the house that used to carry her laughter turned into a place where clocks ticked too loud and windows stared blankly out at nothing. So he moved into the trailer. It was meant to be temporary, just until he could sort things out, though after 5 years of temporary, the word lost its shape. He never touched the attic boxes, never threw out her recipe cards, never could bring himself to fix the broken door handle on the bathroom she never used. Winters were rough, summers were cruel, but Clarence kept to his schedule: early coffee, late dinner, no visitors, and a propane heater that clicked and hissed through the night like it was muttering secrets to itself. The night the fire started, he'd been asleep in the recliner, bourbon half empty, boots still on, dreams crawling in slow. It was a loose wire, or maybe the old heater giving up the ghost after too many years of stubborn service, but whatever it was, it lit up the insulation behind the wall like dry leaves in October. Smoke moves quiet in the beginning, like a thief, creeping low, curling around your lungs before your eyes even open. He would have never known. Not until it was too late. But then, through the crack in the window, he heard something, just barely, a low growl, followed by the sharp scrape of claws against metal. He sat up, coughing, disoriented, eyes burning, and through the haze he saw the dog. Right there on the porch. The mutt had one paw on the screen door and the other pressed against the glass, his eyes glowing with something between warning and urgency. Clarence opened the door without thinking, and the smoke came rolling out like a black wave. Miles didn't hesitate, just stepped back, gave a sharp bark, and then turned, leading the old man into the cold night air. By the time the fire truck got there wasn't much left to save. The trailer had gone up like kindling, the heat peeling the siding off in sheets, the inside reduced to ash and melted plastic. But Clarence? He was standing 20 yards away, wrapped in a blanket, staring at a dog that wouldn't leave his side, no matter how many lights flashed or sirens screamed. The fire chief said, "He saved your life, sir." Clarence didn't answer right away. He was watching Miles, who sat there calm and still, as if waiting for the world to quiet down so they could go back to something that mattered. The next day, Clarence asked around town, but no one knew who the dog belonged to. No tags. No collar. Just those eyes, wise and weary, like they'd seen more than a creature should ever have to. Clarence spent the night in the church basement, lying on a cot with the dog curled at his feet, and for the first time in years, he prayed, not because he thought it would change anything, but because it felt right to give thanks when you've been pulled back from the edge by something you'll never fully understand. The next morning, Clarence did something no one expected, not even himself. He went back to the lot, sifted through the soot and steel until he found his old toolbox, charred but intact, and carried it across town to his small storefront that had been empty since the upholstery shop closed 3 winters ago. With some help from the local boys, he hung a hand-painted sign that read, "Clarence fixes things. Pay what you can." And that's exactly what he did. He fixed irons. He fixed chairs. He fixed transistor radios and broken zippers, and a little girl's pink toy truck with one wheel missing and a button jammed inside the engine bay. And when someone asked why now, after all these years of silence and sorrow, he simply said, "If a dog can drag me out of a fire, I figure I owe this world a little something back." He never put up flyers. Never advertised online. But word got around, like it always does in small places with big hearts. Folks started showing up not just with broken lamps and squeaky hinges, but with stories they needed to tell and hands that wanted to shake his. Clarence didn't talk much, but he listened. And sometimes that was enough. Miles stayed for 3 more days. Long enough to lie on the shop floor while Clarence filed down a rusted blade, long enough to greet a nervous widow who brought in her late husband's wristwatch, and long enough to remind one man that second chances don't always arrive wrapped in fireworks. They sometimes show up muddy, quiet, and smelling faintly of cedar and road dust. And then one morning, Clarence unlocked the door, stepped inside, and saw only a blanket of dog hair on the old rug. No paw prints. No goodbye. Just the echo of something loyal and kind moving on to whatever came next. Clarence looked out the window, wiped his hands on his apron, and smiled just a little. Later that afternoon, a teenage girl who'd brought in a broken toaster asked, "Do you think he's still out there helping people?" "Yes," said the boy, his voice so soft it barely stirred the air between them, but strong enough to stop the room cold. "He helps people." No one had heard that voice before. Not his mother. Not his father. Not the school counselor or the speech therapist with the kind eyes and a basket of plastic animal toys. For 8 long years, the world had turned around him like a silent carousel, full of movement and music that never quite reached his lips. His name was Jacob. Born early, walked late, and lived in a world that didn't always line up with what the rest of us take for granted. The doctors called it autism. The church ladies called it a mystery. His mother called it just Jacob, and every day she prayed for a door to open somewhere, anywhere, so she could know what her boy carried behind those wide, solemn eyes. Words never came. Not at bedtime, not on birthdays, not even when he scraped his knee so bad she could hardly look. He never asked for a toy, never said he was cold, never whispered "Mama," not even in dreams. But he felt things deeply, so deeply it sometimes scared her. Loud noises broke him into pieces. Bright lights sent him hiding in closets. Change was like a storm with no warning. The day he disappeared, the wind had been strange, heavy, not loud, but full of a pressure she couldn't name. They had just come home from the grocery store, her hands full of bags, his eyes fixed on something distant through the window. And when she turned around, he was gone. She ran through the house, calling his name like she always did, even though he never answered. She searched the yard, the fence line, the road, yelling until her voice broke. Neighbors came. Deputies came. Even the old man from the farm up the hill came. But Jacob was nowhere. Just vanished like fog under sun. She found him 5 hours later, just past the edge of the soybean field, where the trees start leaning in close and the grass grows up wild. He was sitting there in the tall stalks, knees pulled to his chest, eyes locked on something just beyond her vision. When she got closer, her legs nearly gave out. A dog, large, still, and dusty, lay beside her son like they'd known each other forever. Not touching, not guarding, not playing, just being. Miles didn't look at her when she arrived, didn't growl or move or raise his tail. He simply turned his head slowly, nodded once, and lowered it back onto his paws. She dropped to her knees, heart pounding, not knowing whether to scream or cry or pray. Jacob turned to her then, his face calm, as clearer than she'd ever seen them. And he said one word. Just one. Miles. It was as if heaven itself stopped turning for a second, just long enough for that syllable to hang in the air like music. She gasped, so hard it hurt her ribs. Then she touched his cheek, and he didn't flinch. He just looked at her, touched her hand, and said it again. Miles. They walked home slowly, hand in hand, and the dog followed a few steps behind, like a shadow that had waited years to be noticed. That night, Jacob sat on the floor of his room and spoke to the dog in low, whispering tones. No full sentences. No conversations. But words. Real words. Words that had never come out of his mouth before, as if some ancient lock had finally found its key. The doctors called it a breakthrough. His mother called it a miracle. But Jacob didn't call it anything. He just said, Miles came. The dog stayed for 2 more days. In those 2 days, Jacob said more than he had in the first 8 years of his life. He named colors. He pointed to clouds. He sang one verse of a song from a cartoon he hadn't watched in months. And when he fell asleep, he clutched a strand of Miles's fur like it was a lifeline to a world he'd only just started to reach. On the morning of the 3rd day, Miles was gone again. Not vanished, not stolen. Just gone. Like a wind that had passed through and moved on without asking for thanks. Jacob didn't cry. He walked out to the road, looked both ways like someone twice his age, and whispered, "Thank you." And from that day forward, he never stopped speaking. Not because Miles had taught him words, but because the silence had finally been filled by something solid. Something kind. Something that didn't ask anything of him except to be who he was, exactly as he was. A week later, Jacob's father, sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee he'd long stopped tasting, looked at the trail that led out of the field and asked quietly, "Where do you think he'll go next?" "He'll go where hearts have stopped speaking," said Martha Whitlow, her hands sunk deep into the earth beside the garden gate, her voice barely louder than the breeze rustling through the old rose bushes they hadn't touched in 3 summers. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but the words just tumbled out, not to anyone in particular, just to the air, or maybe to the old dog lying still and patient just beyond the rusted fence post. He hadn't barked or whined when he came, just appeared near the back steps like he'd wandered out of yesterday and found his way into the middle of something sacred. It had been almost 6 years since Martha last spoke to her husband with a voice that wasn't clipped, brittle, or too quiet to matter. Not since the night they stood under the porch light, the one their son had installed himself, and watched a police cruiser pull slowly up the driveway, its headlights too soft, too solemn, to be delivering anything but ruin. Their boy, David, 22 years old, fresh out of community college, gone in an instant. Car accident on a wet road, no drugs, no alcohol, no one else at fault, just the cruel, blunt force of fate, striking with no warning and no reason that any heart could understand. Grief, for some couples, pulls them close. For others, it drives silence so deep that even breathing together starts to feel like a betrayal of pain. Martha and George had become 2 ghosts in the same house, passing one another in the hallway like strangers, eating meals in separate rooms, tending to their lives in parallel lines that never touched. The garden had once been their shared sanctuary. Every spring, they planted it together, roses and tomatoes, squash and sunflowers, digging with dirty fingers and aching knees, laughing about worms and weeds and how George never could tell cilantro from parsley. But after David died, the soil went dry, the tools rusted where they hung, and the gate at the back of the yard began to lean to one side, as if even it had given up trying to hold anything together. Martha hadn't set foot back there in nearly 2 years. But when she saw the dog, large, gentle, unmoving, resting just beside the cracked stone path, she felt something stir deep inside, like a whisper from her son's bedroom. Back when he used to hum to himself while sketching pictures of birds on the corners of his homework. That evening, she stood at the edge of the yard and just watched him. He didn't flinch, didn't wag, just lifted his head slightly, met her eyes, and blinked, once, then twice, like he'd been waiting all this time for her to finally turn around. The next morning, something strange happened. She found a shoe in the yard. Not hers, not George's, and not a stranger's either. It was small, worn, and unmistakable, David's old running shoe, the one he used to wear when jogging laps around the back fence with the family's first dog, Jasper, back when life still had noise and laughter and a future that felt full. She picked it up slowly, her hand shaking, tears pressing hot behind her eyes, and looked around, but there was no one. Just the dog, sitting calmly near the edge of the garden, watching her like a witness in a quiet courtroom of memory. The next day, there was something else. A photograph, curled and sun-faded, tucked beneath a flower pot on the porch. Martha picked it up with trembling fingers and stared at it until the edges blurred. David again. Younger, smiling, arms wrapped around his parents on their 20th wedding anniversary, cake smeared on George's cheek, and roses blooming in the background like they always did that time of year. She didn't show the photo to George. Not yet. The silence between them still felt too fragile, too brittle to carry the weight of what they'd both been hiding from. On the 3rd morning, the last piece arrived. It was a birthday card, the one David had made for her when he was 16, written in crooked block letters with a heart drawn beside her name. "Thanks for always planting things," it read, "even when I forget to water them." She had saved it once, years ago, but it had vanished in the shuffle of time in closets and boxes sealed during a move she barely remembered. She found it sitting inside the garden gate, beneath a single rose petal. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because something inside her had started growing again, like a root pushing through the dirt after a long, cold season. She stood in the hallway, barefoot, unsure of herself, and then knocked lightly on the door to the den where George always sat. He opened it slowly, his eyes surprised but not startled, as if maybe, just maybe, he had been waiting, too. "I think we should fix the garden," she said, her voice soft but steady. He didn't speak right away, just nodded. And the next morning, they did. Side by side, Without a single word at first, they pulled weeds, trimmed branches, mended the broken gate, and unearthed the old bench where they used to sit and sip sweet tea with their boy between them. And somewhere in the quiet hours between sunrise and lunch, George reached out and touched her hand. Just for a moment, no pressure, no words, just enough to remind her that they were still alive. Miles stayed nearby. He never stepped inside the garden. Just rested beneath the trees, eyes half closed, watching as something long-buried began to breathe again. And when the bench was clean and the roses watered, Martha turned to George and whispered, "Do you think he's ever going to stop?" "No," said Walt Avery, his voice cracking on the edges like old vinyl left too long in the sun. "No, I don't think he ever will." He was sitting in the shadows of a place most folks in town had forgotten even existed, a weather-worn brick building with peeling white trim and dusty windows that hadn't been washed since the choir disbanded. Once upon a time, this had been the music hall, a simple one-room space behind the old Methodist church where children learned hymns, teenagers sang harmonies, and old folks gathered just to feel something stir in their chest again. And Walt had been the man behind the piano. For 40 years, he had taught them to breathe deep, to listen hard, to find their part in the swell of something bigger than themselves. His fingers had danced across the keys like they were telling stories only the heart could hear, and he believed, deep down, that music was the last honest thing left in the world. But time plays its own tune, and Walt's hands began to tremble. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a hesitation at the end of a phrase, a missed note that could be blamed on a faulty pedal or a cold morning. But soon, the shake grew bolder, crept up his wrists, claimed the steadiness he had once taken for granted. Then came the forgetting. Names slipped away. Directions blurred. He found himself staring at sheet music he'd written himself, unable to recall what came next. His doctor called it mild cognitive decline. Walt called it betrayal. So he stopped playing, locked the hall, closed the lid, turned the key in the rusted front door, and dropped it into a drawer he never opened again. Folks asked for him at first, then less often, then not at all. He spent his days in a small house just down the road, sitting in a chair that faced nothing in particular, listening to a radio that was never quite in tune. His daughter called from Atlanta every other Sunday, cheerful and hurried, promising to visit soon. But Walt knew how that word worked. Soon had a way of stretching until it broke. Then one morning, he saw something strange through the frosted glass of his front window. A dog. Old, dust-colored, and still. It didn't bark or move when Walt tapped the glass. It didn't flinch when he opened the door and stepped out in his slippers. It just looked at him calm, steady, unafraid, and then turned, slowly, and began walking toward the church. And Walt, God help him, followed. He hadn't been to the music hall in nearly 6 years. The steps creaked beneath his weight. The key was still in the drawer. The lock still turned. And inside, though it smelled of mildew and mothballs, the old upright piano still sat beneath the window, its lid closed, its ivory teeth yellowed with time. The dog pattered across the floor, circled once, then laid down beside the bench as if claiming his post. Walt didn't know why he sat down. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was because the silence had lasted long enough, and something inside him remembered the man he used to be. His hands hovered above the keys. They shook. But slowly, painfully, he pressed one finger down. Then another. A note here. A chord there. Simple. Hesitant. But alive. The sound was rough, out of tune, missing the smooth grace it once carried. But it was music. Real music. Music pulled from the deep part of a soul that had not yet given up. That afternoon, the back door creaked open. A voice called out, young, clear, curious. "Mr. Avery?" He turned and saw her, Angela McLeod, 17 years old now, but unmistakably the same girl who used to sing Amazing Grace with her eyes closed and her hands clenched in nervous fists. Behind her stood 3 others, one with a guitar, another with a violin case, and a third holding a notebook and hope in her smile. We heard the piano," Angela said, her eyes wet. Walt opened his mouth, then closed it again. And then he nodded. That night, the music returned. Rough at first. Uncertain. But then fuller. Louder. Warmer. The kind of music that makes you stand still in the hallway just to listen. Word spread like wildfire in dry grass. By the end of the week, they had to open the windows to let the voices out into the street. And through it all, Miles stayed near. Never in the way. Never underfoot. Just there, by the wall, under the table, beside the pews, listening like he understood every word, every measure, every story carried inside each trembling note. 3 days later, Walt opened the hall alone, early in the morning, and found only dust on the floor where the dog had once rested. He smiled, not the kind that showed teeth, but the kind that softened the eyes, and whispered to the empty room, "Go on, old boy. Someone else needs you now." Then he sat down at the bench and began to play a melody he hadn't touched in over 40 years. Outside, as the sun rose, a passerby paused and asked a stranger, "That old dog, where do you think he's going now?" "I think he's going home," said Thomas Ray, a man who hadn't spoken that word, home, out loud in longer than he cared to admit. But the sound of it still carried the kind of weight only old bones and older memories truly understand. He stood alone at the edge of a field where the grass had grown wild and unbothered, where no one had come to build, to mend, or to mourn. The foundation stones of a house that once held stories now lay buried beneath weeds, with only the chimney left standing like a stubborn sentinel watching over the ruins. Thomas hadn't come here in years. Not since the fire. Not since the night the roof collapsed inward and the sky turned orange, and the sound of wood splitting apart echoed like a scream across the hills. He had stood then, just across the road, powerless to move, helpless to save, his fist clenched so tightly his fingernails broke the skin of his palms. That house had belonged to his father. The man who raised him, hard but fair, who taught him how to sharpen a blade and drive a nail, who cooked bacon every Saturday morning with the radio playing low, always jazz, never country. It was where Thomas learned to read, to work, to wait. And it was where he said goodbye on a Tuesday morning when his father, already deep in years, had looked him straight in the eye and said, "Don't wait to come back, son. Time runs faster than you think." But Thomas hadn't come back. Not until the smoke did. And by then, there was nothing left. The insurance company called it an electrical fault. The neighbors said it was a shame. The county said the land wasn't worth the trouble of clearing. But Thomas knew in his gut, that something had been lost there that would never grow back. So he stayed away. Built a life 3 counties over. Found a job, paid his bills, stopped answering questions about the past. No one in his new life even knew he'd come from here, from this slope of land that once smelled of wood smoke and pine and breakfast grease. But that morning, something stirred. A call from no phone. A tug with no hands. He drove without knowing why, stopped without knowing where, and walked with feet that somehow remembered every step, every root, every slant of ground beneath his boots. And there, just ahead, among the bramble and ash, stood the dog, gray in the face, slow to rise, but unmistakable. Thomas didn't say a word at first, just stood there, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't name, and watched as the dog, this strange, noble, road-worn creature, took 3 steps forward, then collapsed gently in the tall grass, not from pain, but from exhaustion older than years. Thomas knelt beside him. The dog didn't whimper or shake, just looked up at him with eyes that held so many lives, so many people, so many moments, that it felt like time itself had curled up there beside the ruins and laid its head down to rest. Thomas reached out, touched the fur, still warm, still soft, and felt something deep inside begin to crack. And then, he wept. Not for the house. Not for the fire. Not even for the man who raised him. He wept for every mile that dog had walked, for every soul he had found, for every goodbye he had never been given. And most of all, he wept because something about this moment felt final, not sad, not tragic, just finished. He stayed there through the afternoon. At one point, he thought he might carry the dog to his truck, find a vet, do something. But the dog didn't need saving. That much was clear. He just needed someone to stay with him as the road ended. As the sun began to slip low, a sound broke the stillness. A boy's voice. Quiet. Barely there. Across the clearing, a young couple stood by a white SUV, looking confused, worried, unsure whether to move closer. Between them stood a little boy, thin, pale, eyes wide, holding tightly to a small backpack and a silence that didn't seem to fit the moment. Thomas turned to them and called out, "You folks all right?" The woman nodded. We just moved in across the hill. Our son, he wandered this way. Said he saw a dog." The boy took 1 step forward, then another. And before anyone could stop him, he ran. Ran straight to the dog and dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around the tired body like he'd been waiting his whole life to find him. Miles didn't flinch. Didn't move. Just rested his head gently in the boy's lap and let out a breath long and low, like a song finally reaching its final note. The boy looked up at Thomas and said, in a voice as soft as the wind before rain, "He's mine now." Thomas smiled, though tears blurred the edges of everything. The boy's father stepped closer, laid a hand on Thomas's shoulder, and asked, "Sir, do you know where he came from?" Yes, Thomas said, his voice low, steady, and carrying the hush of someone speaking inside a church, even though they were only standing in a patch of wild grass where an old life used to be. I know exactly where he came from. He took off his cap, not to wipe his brow or shield his eyes, but because something sacred had settled over that moment, the kind of stillness that only falls when time folds in on itself and you feel history breathing right next to you. His hands trembled just enough to give his age away, but his words held steady as he looked down at the boy who knelt beside the dog, cradling its head like it was the most fragile thing in the whole wide world. Thomas took a breath, then spoke again, slower now, not for drama, but because the truth deserves space to unfold. He came from here, he said, gesturing to the charred outline of the old house, to the crumbling chimney, and the soil that still remembered the shape of footsteps long since vanished. This was the place that raised him, and the man who raised me. The boy's parents exchanged a glance, uncertain, caught between confusion and reverence, as if they knew the story was changing but didn't yet understand how or why. Thomas turned toward them, his voice growing a little softer, a little deeper. "That dog's name is Miles," he said, "and a long time ago, he belonged to my father, the kind of man who didn't say much, but who knew how to listen, how to sit with you in silence, and make it feel like the whole world had slowed down just to give you room to breathe." He paused, eyes sweeping across the field, where wildflowers now grew in places once covered by hardwood floors and Sunday shoes. Miles was just a pup when we found him behind the barn, skinny and shaking, with a busted leg and eyes that looked too wise for how young he was. My father took him in, of course, fixed him up, taught him nothing fancy, just kindness and patience, and how to stay close to someone who needed company. Thomas looked back at the dog, old now, still, but not gone, and continued with a quiet certainty. When my father got sick, near the end, that dog never left his side. Didn't bark, didn't whine, just laid next to his bed, day and night, like he was holding the world in place with nothing but presence. He swallowed hard, cleared his throat, and let the next sentence fall slowly. When the old man died, Miles stopped eating, stopped looking at anyone, and one day he just disappeared. No one saw where he went. I thought he'd gone into the woods to lie down and finish it quietly, the way animals sometimes do when they know their work is done. He chuckled softly, just once. But I was wrong. He looked at the boy now, this small, solemn child with his arms wrapped around something ancient, something loyal, something more than fur and breath. Miles didn't die that day, Thomas said. He started walking. The father frowned slightly. Walking where? Thomas's answer was so gentle it barely stirred the wind. To every place my father ever told him about. To every person he ever sat with, helped, healed, or held on to when life got too heavy to carry alone. See, my daddy wasn't just a man who fixed tractors and drank black coffee and mumbled through church hymns. He was something else. Quietly. Without ever drawing attention to it. And Miles, well, he must have remembered it all. Every story, every porch, every heart that broke just a little too far. There was silence then, not heavy, but deep. A silence filled with understanding. Thomas looked down at the dog again. "And now," he said, kneeling beside the boy, "he's come home. Not just here, to this land. But here," he said, touching the boy's chest lightly, "to this child who needed him most." The boy looked up, not with tears, but with the wide, solemn gaze of someone who has known too much sadness too soon, and yet still has room for wonder. "He's mine now," the boy whispered again. And this time, Thomas smiled. "Yeah," he said, "he sure is." The air grew still. Even the birds seemed to pause. Miles lifted his head, just a little, one final time, and looked from the boy to the man, then past them both, toward the woods that framed the old house like a memory leaning in. And then, with a breath long and steady, like the last page of a story finally read aloud, he closed his eyes. No whimper. No struggle. Just stillness. Deep and quiet and whole. They buried him that evening beneath the oak tree near the chimney, the place where the morning sun hits first, and the wind always moves just enough to feel like breath. The boy placed a single stone on the mound. Thomas carved a name into a piece of wood with a pocket knife older than he could remember. It read, Miles. He walked us home. That night, as the stars rose and the house across the hill began to glow with warm yellow light, the boy sat on the porch beside his parents and asked softly, "Do you think he knew what he was doing?" The answer, dear listener, is this. Yes. He knew the whole way. He always did. Because sometimes, the ones we lose don't disappear, they simply walk ahead, clearing the road, lighting the path, and waiting at the end, just long enough for us to catch up. And when they lie down for the last time, we don't bury them. We plant them, so that something in us begins to bloom again. And if you ever see a dog walking the shoulder of a long, dusty road, don't call him back. He's not lost. He's just not done yet. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.